Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We all know the old paradox: if a tree falls in the forest, but no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? If you celebrated Tu B'Shvat with us at our Seder Thursday night, you know my new favorite answer to that question, which is from forest scientist Peter Wohlleben. He writes, "If a tree falls in a forest, there are other trees listening." He argues that trees are so much more complicated than we give them credit for, that they have almost human-like capacities to communicate and feel. He tells the story of a time that he stumbled upon the gnarled remains of an enormous tree stump. He could tell that the tree must have been cut down 400 years ago, and yet, in what remained, he noticed an entire reserve of fresh green chlorophyll. In other words, the tree was still alive, which is impossible. Without leaves to catch the sun, without photosynthesis, no tree could possibly survive 400 years. So how did it? He writes, the surrounding beech trees were pumping sugar to the stump to keep it alive. This Shabbat following Tu B'Shvat, the birthday of the trees, I wanted to talk about how complex and miraculous trees are. I wanted to share something that might move us to reinvigorate our Jewish commitment to work and guard this garden God gave us, as we read in Genesis 2:15. But instead, I want to talk about something else, because this week, a tree fell in the forest. I lost my Grandpa Howard. It feels difficult to talk about him while we as a Jewish community are holding so much collective and personal grief right now. As we tell the stories of our brothers and sisters in Israel, of our fallen hostages and soldiers, we feel our hearts ripping open as if they were our own family and dear friends. And for some of us, they actually are blood relatives and dear friends. In all the different ways we experience grief, we experience it together, because that's what it means to be a part of Am Yisrael, the people, the nation of Israel. If one of us falls, the rest of us hear it. And we respond by redirecting our energies toward keeping their memories alive. We pump our sugar in the form of prayers and Kaddish, Yartzeit, and Yizkor. We tell their stories. We carry them with us, just like Moses carries Joseph's bones with him out of Egypt this week in Parshat B'Shalach. We read, Vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo, ki hashbea hishbia et bnei Yisrael lemor, pakod yifkod Elohim etchem, v'ha'alitem et atzmotai mizeh itchem. And Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had exacted an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will be sure to take notice of you, then you shall carry up my bones from here with you. After 400 years in Egypt, like the 400-year-old tree stump being kept alive by its community, the Israelites keep Joseph's memory alive by honoring their oath and carrying his bones. Rabbi Bachya, the great 13th, 14th century Spanish commentator, notes that while the rest of the Israelites were busy with the mitzvah of despoiling the Egyptians on their way out, it was actually Moses who personally took it upon himself to fulfill this generation's old promise. Bachya explains that Moses wanted to remind the people that material wealth could only get us so far. If we want to reach the promised land, we have to carry with us the wisdom of our ancestors, because nothing is more precious than that. So, I'd like to share, if that's okay, some wisdom from my Grandpa Howard. He was a doctor, an OB-GYN, and a philosophy major at Brown University. He retired before I was born, so I never experienced him as a doctor, but I experienced him as a philosopher all the time. Even when we were just little kids, he never shied away from asking us some of life's great unanswerable questions, like, are you ticklish? That might not immediately strike you as philosophical, but it was. because we would instinctively squeal, "No, no," and try to worm ourselves free, unsuccessfully, as he'd tickle us to the point of uncontrollable laughter and trouble breathing. And it was only years into this trap that we finally discovered the way out. Yes, one of us grandkids finally had the wisdom to say, "You are?" he asked, as if that was what he'd been waiting to hear all this time. "Yes." "Okay then," he said, letting us go. "That's it? That's all we had to say?" Grandpa Howard smiled and said, "Consider this a lesson in telling the truth." That may just have been him having fun, but as a philosopher, he deeply valued the truth. And I think he wanted us to as well, from a young age. "Are you ticklish?" "Yes," would have saved us years of the kind of laughter that hurts. He was a lifelong learner whose favorite thing to do was to sit in comfy chairs next to my grandma Marlene, whom he loved with all his heart, and to read together while listening to classical music, carefully curated from his iPad. I remember Grandma once mentioned how much she enjoyed his playlist, and I noticed both pride and genuine joy in the expression on my grandpa's face. As I got older, he'd level up his lessons, like, "What's the difference between knowledge and wisdom?" His answer was that knowledge is what you know. Wisdom is knowing how much you don't know. Grandpa Howard had a lot of knowledge, but one of the things that made him so unique is that he was also truly wise. He freely admitted when he didn't know something, which was usually followed by asking us for help downloading more classical music onto his iPad, which we gladly did so he could spend his days reading with Grandma. I'd note the same look of pride and genuine joy on my grandpa's face whenever he was in the presence of my mother, Patty, whom he called Tisha. She has always carried him with her in so many ways, following in his footsteps as a doctor too, though of internal and palliative medicine. And while I never got to experience Grandpa as a doctor, he must have treated each patient with the level of care with which he'd treat a member of his own family, because that's how my mother treats her patients. And she is so very proudly Howard's daughter. As an OBGYN, he brought babies into the world. Rabbi Alex and I were both really looking forward to him meeting his great-grandchild. But if he can hear this, I'd like you to know that you will. Because we carry you with us, and I'm going to tickle her until she learns how to tell the truth. The Midrash, Creative Rabbinic Commentary in Bereshit Rabbah, says that the sea only split due to the merit of Joseph's bones. It points to the way similar words are used when describing the splitting of the sea and in Joseph's story. For example, we read in Psalm 114, Hayam ra'a veyanos, the sea saw and fled. Meanwhile, when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph, we read, Vayanos, vayatza hachutza. He fled and went outside. It's the same word in Hebrew, vayanos. In other words, the Red Sea fled at the sight of Joseph's bones, yielding poetically to a truly wise man's merit, allowing the Israelites to cross over on dry land. Grief can be all-consuming as the Red Sea, and we can drown in it. And there's a time and a season for everything. But this week I'm thinking about how the memory of our ancestors, the merit of the lives they lived, the wisdom that they had, and the Torah that they taught, that's what allows us to navigate the sea of grief on dry land. But memory doesn't happen automatically. We need to learn a lesson from the trees, who expend significant, precious energy keeping what remains of their fellow trees alive. Memory needs to be nurtured and sustained. That's why we turn to Jewish ritual and to Jewish community, so that whenever one of us falls, the rest of us hear. This week, in our B'nai Yeshurun corner of the world, we mark the passing of Dr. Stephen Bloom, father of Dr. Tracy Goldman, and grandfather of Avery, Amanda, Joshua, and Marley, of Andrew Grossman, father of Rachel Kugelman, and grandfather of Jillian and Nathan, of Audrey Galvin, loving spouse of Gerald, who has also passed, and of Dr. Howard Weiss, father of Dr. Patty Jacobs, Grandpa. Zichronam levracha, may all of their memories be a blessing. Shabbat Shalom.